Hello, I'm Steve Isaacs. I'm an extension professor at the University of Kentucky. I do extension farm management work around the state and around the region. I also teach a couple of courses, undergraduate courses here to about 125 students a year in ag management principles and human resource management. Uh, co-direct our Kentucky Ag Leadership Program and direct our income tax seminar. So that's sort of where I am. I've been here for a long time. A good chunk of my extension programming in recent years has been on this notion of transition or succession planning. And thank you very much for inviting me to share some of these thoughts in this webinar. So with that, let's just jump right into it. Let me see if I can get the share screen function working here. Let's go this way, click share. So hopefully you are seeing my presentation now. Also going to try to drop that down. Okay, let's get rolling. Transition and succession planning, particularly in agriculture, is a big deal. I mean, I think it's been one of the traditions that we've tried to, not do it, you pass down the farm from one generation to the other. We're real proud of multi-generational farms, but yet I keep encountering folks who've not done a very good job of doing that. And there's some good reasons I'm going to share with you here why this is a hot topic right now. A good bit of my extension programming has been focused on this. I will say at the beginning, I am not an attorney. I'm not here to give you free legal advice. I'm not an accountant. I can't give you tax advice. There are professionals who do that. I'm going to talk more about the reason, the process, and some of the things you need to look at and think about to make this process go well. So we know we're proud of what we do, but we just don't do a good job at it. And it's not just ag. A lot of Americans just do not have wills. Farm Journal found that 1 in 5 farms weren't confident that they had a good succession plan. So thus, it's job security for folks like me. Transitioning businesses from one generation to another is hard. In general, a lot of businesses will fail when they transition because they've not given a lot of thought or enough thought to how to make the transition successful and to keep the business functioning as a sustainable business. The last line I've got on this slide. I think this is a statement that I have heard end more discussions than start discussions. It may have been said with good intent, but when somebody, particularly a parent or grandparent, says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of you," oftentimes they mean, "I'm not comfortable talking about this. Let's not talk about it." Well, it's time to talk about it. Okay, that's succession planning. These folks were the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, also known as the Shakers, and they had a lousy succession plan. In the mid-19th century, there were several thousand Shakers living in half a dozen villages or so around the country. There are none today because they did not have a succession plan. The men and women were separate and they didn't have kids. So that didn't work very well. I live line of sight about 5 miles from the Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill, and there are none over there. We've got a good restaurant accommodations, but the Shakers did not have a good succession plan. We're in the process of transitioning about $68 trillion worth of assets to the next generation, but baby boomers, and I'm right in the middle of that generation, and we're transferring a lot of assets. That's a lot when you consider that the entire agriculture, forestry, processing, manufacturing, delivery, restaurants, everything in the food and fiber sector is about $1 trillion a year. We're about to transfer 60 times that from one generation to the next. For years, I've heard, and we've talked about this notion of aging farmers, and it's a problem. Well, is it a problem or is it an opportunity? It just is. I went back. I wasn't sure that all of the rhetoric was right, so I went back and looked at every single ag census back to 1977, and age of principal operator has increased about 1 year per census cycle since then. And right now, the age of principal operators by the 2017 census was 59.4. That's a bit misleading because in multi-generational farms, they don't count the younger folks. They just count whoever the principal operator is. So I think that probably skews it a little higher. But when I looked at another source, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they say that the median age of farmers is 56.4. That is the oldest occupational group in the country. followed by judges, preachers, bus drivers, and tailors. But farmers are the oldest group out there. So yes, it is an issue. Aging going to transfer a lot of assets. But the young folks I work with see this more as an opportunity than a problem. For you folks in North Carolina, let's do some math. You got about $45 billion worth of ag assets in the state. Now, I'll show you a graphic here in just a second. We tend to transition about 10% of assets a year. So that means in 10 years, we're going to transfer nearly a $1 billion worth of assets in agriculture. Another way of looking at that is $2.4 million a day, or transitioning a 500-acre farm every day for the next 10 years. So yes, there's a lot of opportunity out there for doing this right. Show you this graphic. This, I said there a second ago that we transition about 10% of the land. Here's something I really want to point out to you, is we tend to make most of that within families. So only about a fourth of this gets sold to somebody who's not a relative. So a lot of this land is indeed going to transition within families. And it's going to happen with every farm, not just the 10% or 20% in the next 10 years. Every farm will someday experience transition, even if you don't have a plan. The state has a plan for you. And usually when I do these workshops, we have an attorney on site and he explains what the state's transition plan is. So it's going to transition one way or the other, the right way or the wrong way. If you just want to transition the assets, you can do that with a will. Get a good attorney and figure out how you want to transition the assets or pass those along. You can do that. If you want this to be a viable plan for continuation of the business to subsequent generations, then you need to put more thought into it. You need more than a will. You need a way of doing this. So instead of saying, don't worry, I'll take care of you, it ought to be, here's how we're going to take care of things. So I hope I can encourage you to do that. Okay, time out. As we go through this, I want you to ask this question. Is this indeed an opportunity, or is it an obligation? That needs to be answered. Because sometimes I've seen businesses passed on that they just felt like it was their duty, their obligation, and that does not work very well. Consider this within your family, and I'll probably come back to this notion. Is it an opportunity or an obligation? So for the rest of the time, I want to talk about these 4 questions. What do you want to transfer? Can you afford it? Particularly if you're bringing another generation into the business. How do you go about doing it? What do you do to make this happen? And then the thing that drives a lot of folks out to my face-to-face workshops is, how do we manage the death taxes? I'm going to tackle question number 4 first. Look at these graphs. The current law as it's written, and it may very well change. That's why I have well maybe as being an issue. Under current law, almost no farms, or a very small number of farms, would owe any inheritance taxes. Because right now, under current law, a couple can exempt a little over $23 million worth of assets that have no inheritance taxes due on them. So that covers most farms. Now, larger operations, yes, they need to consider that. But I figured if you're worth more than $24 million, you probably can afford to get some help anyway. Lots of discussion right now. Some plans or some things being discussed in the American Families Plan that would reduce things like stepped up basis, that would drop those exemptions. So there's a lot of interest in whether this would happen. The graph on the right suggests that for many farms, for 80%, it still wouldn't change it because a lot of farms are relatively small, but size does matter. Before I leave this, I think death taxes are the sort of the paper tiger of transition planning. Lots of folks are concerned about it, and some of them should be. And if it gets you started on the process, then more power to you. That's great. But I have seen farms that had to pay taxes. I have never seen a farm destroyed by death taxes. I have seen, and if you're watching this video, I'll guarantee you have seen or know of family farms that were destroyed by the families. So I think the taxes, while important, are the secondary issue. We need to do the other things right. So question number one, I'll back up since I answered question number 4 to begin with. Let's back up to question number 1. What do you want to transfer? The tangible and intangible assets, the management, the leadership. If you're going to transition this as a business, all of these need to be transferred. For the tangible assets, the things that you can count, the things that you can see, the things you can put your hands on or walk on, you've got a will. Do it with a will. You can transfer those. Now, the intangible assets are of value to the business, but are harder to transfer or transition. The reputation and character that you have built up in a business over years, that is part of the value of the business. Need to think about transferring those sorts of things as well. So what are you going to transfer? The assets, both tangible and intangible. Think about transitioning the management. I'm going to have more to say about this later on, but it's what is the division of responsibilities that you're going to separate this out. Knowledge of the financials, the decision and financial authority. These are all management things that need to be transitioned and probably should be transitioned earlier rather than later. And think about this as the process. Also, not just the management of the business, but leadership. One of the questions I like to ask young folks that come in these workshops is I will ask them, if mom and dad died, what would you do different next year or 5 years down the road? That is strategy. That's the strategic planning. That's the leadership of the business. There's other leadership components. The reason I teach an HR course is that we've done a woefully poor job, I think, of preparing people to lead people. So if you have labor out there, that's important. How do you find them? How do you hire them? How do you train them? How do you retain them? So that's all part of it as well. And then I think lots of family businesses have off-farm leadership, tend to be leaders in the community or in the church or in commodity groups or state organizations. Think about how you want to transition that as well. If you just want to transition the estate, get an attorney. If you want to transition the business, pay attention for the rest of the day. Okay, question number 2, is the business profitable? Transitioning or transferring a money losing business to the next generation is not doing them a favor. So you need to know if you have a profitable business that will sustain another generation. I'm going to hit some time on standard of living, family living expenses. We'll get to that. Particularly important if the business is going to be supporting multiple families. And I want to talk about the need for net income, not gross income, being the measurement for that. I take my economics degree away if I don't show you some numbers. So here's some numbers out of our Kentucky Farm Business Management Program. This is every other year for the last 10 years or so. And I'm not going to dig deep into this, but I do want to point out a few things. Each column is how the income from the farm is split up. It goes 4 ways: operating expenses, depreciation expenses, interest expenses, and what's left is the income. So if that's $1 in 2020, for instance, 65 cents pay operating expenses, 10 cents depreciation, 4 cents for interest, and 21 cents for that's left over to pay family living, taxes, to pay the notes, the principal portion of the debt, and to grow the business. There's a lot of variability around that. This is out of our Kentucky Farm Business Management Program where we have some good data. But if you look at this nationally, that ratio has a lot of variability. You're looking at that bottom line and seeing from 23 cents out of the dollar to down to 6 cents out of the dollar over the last 10 years. Looking at this nationally, that ratio has varied pretty much from 0.10 to 0.35 with a lot of ups and downs. So income variability is a big issue and a big deal. Okay, let's hit some family living. This again is out of our Kentucky Farm Business Management Program. We have about 160 farms that we have good, reliable data on family living expenses. And again, lots of numbers here I want you to focus in. The top part of that, and this is the last 3 years, looks at family living expenses, and taxes and Social Security and this is an average, and we've been around $90,000 per family. And I think family size is like 2.5 or something like that. There's a ton of variability about this. There are families that live off a lot less, and there are farm families that spend a lot more. So roughly $90,000 of family living and taxes. If you look at the bottom of this table, the net income from the farm and net off-farm income, when those are put together, you subtract out the family living and expenses, what we've got left at the bottom, that residual, is what is left to pay principal payments on notes and to grow the business. So 2018, 2019, that's not a lot of money left to pay off the debt. Now, 2020, when there was a lot of money in agriculture with good crop prices and some substantial infusions of cash, looks a lot different. But remember, there's a lot of variability with this. This information, this is just the last 3 years. Let me show you graphically what this looks like for a 20-year period. And the red line here is average family living expenses out of our Kentucky Farm Business Management Program. And over that 20 years, it's tended to be in the $75,000 to $100,000 range and generally trending up, leveling off the last few years. That's family living. Let me impose on that the net farm income that they had available. And you see a lot of variability. The difference between that blue line and that red line is the residual, or what's left then to grow the business and to pay down debt and do other things with after you've paid taxes and Social Security. So if I just took that residual amount and looked at it with this graph, this is what's there. And note that in a couple of down years, the farm and off-farm income did not cover family living and taxes. So, something had to give. Money borrowed, assets sold, something had to give. But look at the variability of this. But you need to think about this in the context of, can we afford and should we afford to do this? So my original question, is farm profitable? We need to know. Secondly, what standard of living do you expect for both the family that's staying or a family that's coming on? If you need to support multiple families, that's important. My good friend, Dr. Dave Cole, says that it costs more to be old than it does to be young. He says by about 25%, because older folks get sicker and sometimes want to travel. So these are things you got to consider. So if you took my number, $90,000 plus or minus a lot, you use your number. If you've got a good number, use it. But one of the big mistakes that I see, particularly some of my students that want to go back into a farm make, is that they kind of figure out how many more acres or how many more cows it would take to generate enough income to live off of, but it's net, not gross. That's why I showed that net income from operations ratio a minute ago. If it's 0.14, which is the average of that table that I had in there, and you need $90,000, you divide that 0.14 into 90,000, and you got to have over $600,000 worth of gross to generate $90,000 worth of net. The rule of thumb that I use is you're going to have $4 to $6 of gross income for every dollar of net that you need. If it's 50,000, if it's 70,000, if it's 90,000, then you divide that net income ratio, and that gives you the number. If that ratio drops down to 0.1 and you need $100,000, you got to add $1 million worth of gross. So this is not an insignificant thing to consider. Okay, I think that having a good retirement income for the folks who built the business is the first priority. Now, you decide the priorities in your family, but I think it's important. And determine what those needs are going to be. Do mom and dad or grandma and grandpa, do they want to travel? Do they want to change some lifestyle? What costs are going to change? And what other income sources do they have? Maybe some Social Security, though I've observed that since farmers have done everything they could to minimize paying taxes, they've also minimized paying Social Security. So sometimes there's not a lot of that there. But are there pensions? Are there other assets? Did they all along consider they were going to sell part of the farm to retire? Those you've got to discuss. And as you're planning for the future, for both generations, you've got to think about or consider inflation. This graphic is the last 50 years of inflation, and I show it to illustrate the point that there is no one over 60 who's ever forgotten inflation and no one under 40 who's ever seen it until just the last few months, and it has reared its ugly head. Um, the 50-year range is from 0.1 to 13.3%. Financial planners often use a 4% inflation rate, and for 50 years, that's about right. But for the last 3 decades, we've been relatively modest inflation, running in a 2% a year. Now, with all this happened in the last year and a half, supply shortages, number of other things, then the inflation rate's as high as it's been in a long time. Right now, currently, it stands at about 5.4% for the past 12 months. Planning for the future, if that were to persist, then you would need 10 years from now, $169 to buy what $100 would today. If inflation were 10%, you'd need $250. So it's got to be considered because this is a long run planning thing. Question number 3, the tough one. How do you make this happen? How does it work? And I'm going to start out with one of the toughest ones, and that is, how do we start the conversation? This is an awkward conversation to start for kids, because if they're reluctant to bring it up, if they do, it almost looks like they're greedy. You know, what am I going to get out of this? So here I put the burden on the older generation. The parents, the grandparents should be the ones who start the conversation. I work with lenders a lot, and I think a lender or a financial advisor may also be the catalyst. That lender can say, hey, you know, we need a succession plan to make this loan if we're going to do it. The thing I've got down there at the bottom, this is actually a quote from my wife. Her mother years ago was one of those who, I don't want to talk about this, or don't worry, I'll take care of you kind of person. Well, she needed to do some planning. And my wife finally just sat her down and said, okay, Mom, let's start at the end. What songs do you want at your funeral? She told her, and then work backwards from there. And those songs were played at her funeral a little over a year ago. So that's a bit morbid way of doing it, but I mean, if whatever it takes to get the conversation started, get it started. Now, keep in mind, you know, if you're a parent, they're your kids and you think the world of them, but that does not necessarily qualify them to be the manager. I have observed that management has a fairly low heritability coefficient. Management, I think, is taught, not learned, or not inherited. Again, in thinking about this, is this an opportunity or an obligation? To make this work, absolutely do not protect the next generation from the business issues. Show the kids the books. They need to know what's going on. And some generations are reluctant to do that. And finally, on this one, don't forget sons-in-laws and daughters-in-law. They're part of the family too. They need to be part of that discussion. Another big issue, another sticking point, and the reason that sometimes this conversation doesn't happen is it's hard for folks to determine how to treat siblings fairly. And fair may not mean equal. The issue, particularly if one sibling stayed on the farm and the others left. I do not have the solution to this. I do not have a magic formula. Each family has to figure this out. But if the family considers that the sibling stayed on the farm and they deserve more, I don't know, give them 2 shares to 1 for the others, or 3. I don't know. That is up to every family. I have a colleague up in Ohio who says, look at the contribution that sibling who stayed, what have they contributed? How much has the business grown since they came in? And they ought to get a good chunk. Maybe they're responsible for half or more than half of that growth. So this is not an easy question. It varies from family to family, but it is not an excuse for not doing it. Again, this starts with the parents. It needs to be a reasonable plan with realistic expectations. And it's more than just dad or saying, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to turn some of this over to you. It's more than that. I'm going to mention something here for the first time and talk more about this transition team. Want to get into that. But keep in mind that when you do this, this is not, you do it once and it's over. You need to update this periodically, particularly as there are changes in the business. So let's talk about a transition team. And I've had folks say, oh, farmers won't do this. They will too. And consider this. You are not going to find a single person who's likely to have all the skill and expertise to make this happen. You need the professionals. You need an attorney. You need an accountant to help you through and help understand the profitability or to understand the tax implications. Got a financial planner, they need to be there. I think lenders need to be at the table. If you've got people who you value their opinion that run similar businesses, I'm not going to tell you who all ought to be on this team, but it needs to be a team. I've seen teams that had a mediator and they needed it that comes in there. This is the advisory board for the transition. They're going to bring the expertise and the skills to the table. The other thing, one of those people or somebody else needs to be a facilitator, somebody who takes notes, who writes things down, who probably circulates those notes at the end or goes over those notes and says, okay, this is what we agreed on, and gets the agreement while everybody's there. Last point. I used to say that this was something that you gathered around the kitchen table. I do not believe that anymore. Go somewhere else. The kitchen table is not the place to do this. Everything good or bad that family has ever experienced is around that kitchen table. The other thing I've seen, and I've been in some of these discussions where they got really down to the meat of things and we're getting into some discussion of things that needed to be talked about, and it became a little contentious. And I've heard mom say, I don't want to hear any more of that. It ended the discussion. Go somewhere else. Go to a bank boardroom, an extension office, get offsite and check the phones at the door. Concentrate on the topic at hand. Okay, I mentioned lenders. I do some lenders conferences, and I try to drive this home to lenders that they can have a significant role. Oftentimes, if there's not a good accounting system or a farm business management advisor, that lender may know as much about the financials as anybody. They certainly have an interest in the sustainability of the plan. If there's going to be new assets or changes in operating capital, the lender needs to know who's going to have the financial authority when that transitions. And the lender can, like I say, be the catalyst. They can be the person who says this needs to be in that loan narrative. They can ask pointed questions. They can ask questions sometimes that family members can't. And I think that's a good reason to have them there. They can be the catalyst that gets this started. Now, transferring ownership's easy of assets. You write a will, easy relative to other things. I know a lot of fights have occurred over the transition of assets. I have seen families broken up over grandma's quilt. So it's in a legal sense, it's easy. Psychologically, sometimes it's harder, but it's a job for the professionals, the accountants, the attorneys. That's what you hire them for, and they do their job. However, management, which I mentioned has a low heritability coefficient, is not as easy to transition. Now, I know parents don't believe that, but it's just because they're your kids doesn't mean that they know everything you know. They have to be taught. And building that management team needs to be a multi-generational process. And I think it starts with the books. Start with the financials. Lay them out there. Everybody should know. This should not be the closely held secret that is revealed only after somebody dies. Point here. Don't share responsibility, divide it. In families, shared responsibility, the authority will revert to the oldest person there. So don't say you're going to share it, divide it up. Put the crops, the livestock, something that is their responsibility, and let them take it. Look for leadership development opportunities. I mentioned I co-direct the Ag Leadership Program in Kentucky. That's a good one. Many states in North Carolina has a program as well. Leadership seminars, commodity groups that have leadership development activities, local leadership development. Take advantage of those, because I think you need to transition that leadership role as well. The family that has been prominent in local boards and statewide activities is probably going to continue in the next generation. So think about transitioning that as well. And I have a whole other presentation on when is a long time too long, because I've seen people stay in those roles way, way, way too long. When do you do this? How do you time it? Build a timeline and a calendar when you're actually going to do this. Put things down when things are going to happen, or the triggering events that are going to transition an asset or transition certain roles. Have that in the plan, so that when something happens, when someone dies, everybody knows what's going to happen, that there are no surprises. The mark of a good transition plan is that there are no surprises when somebody dies. So how do you make this happen? I've alluded to this. Have clear lines of responsibility. You can test the plan. You can look at this component and say, give it a test. If it doesn't look like it's working, go back and revise it. Try something different. I think a good test is for the parents to take a long vacation and put them on a cruise ship with no cell signal or something. Leave the cell phone at home. Let the folks make the decision. But again, this is not one and done. This is not Kentucky basketball. This is family transition, and it is an ongoing process that you need to revisit. Okay, I'll wrap this up. Why do transitions fail? Mixing family and business, which sounds kind of redundant because we've been talking about that for the last 30 minutes, right? Well, this is where it really gets difficult. Farm family businesses are interwoven, and this is where the difficulties are going to arise. So you've got to really think about not just the business, but the family relationships as well. They fail because somebody didn't have the strength or to do it, or the desire to do it. Again, for about the third time, make sure you've answered this question as whether this is an opportunity or an obligation. Unexpected events, things that you didn't anticipate. An unexpected death or divorce or the economy downturn or anything. There are a number of external reasons that can drive these failures as well. This is a big one. The lack of support from the parents. There needs to be some affirmation and approval. Again, for the fourth time probably, this is an opportunity. Make sure it's an opportunity, not an obligation. Another reason they fail clearly is sibling disputes. We've all seen this happen. You got to revisit that fair issue, and fair may not be equal. So every family has to decide that. Big reason, the biggest reason, failure to communicate. This is, I think, the big reason that family transition plans fail. And some of the communication failures, I already referred to this. Don't worry, I'll take care of you. May be well-intentioned, but it tends to shut things down. Families are masters of nonverbal communication. Now, the folks who study this say somewhere between half and 90% of all communication that we do is nonverbal. Within families, I think it's higher because we just communicate a lot of things without saying them. The others are pretty obvious. I mean, some of the negative things. I have seen businesses and families that wouldn't even talk to each other. They would come to somebody like me, and I'd talk to one I'm on one day and one the next day. Those are tough. And that last one, changing the subject, just sort of relates back to that. Don't worry, I'll take care of you. So, in conclusion, a major challenge is to determine whether or not the business can afford the transition. That's why I spent some time on family living and net income. It's net, not gross, that supports it. The family's got to figure out how they want to handle the transition, use that transition team, build a transition plan, because the biggest challenge is to create and execute that transition plan. So every farm is going to experience transition. Whether you have a plan or not, it's going to happen. It's going to be there. It can happen with a will, or it can be a well-defined, commonly agreed upon plan to continue the business. And it's not a will, it's a way. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to put this down and to communicate this to you. I hope we have an opportunity to do this face-to-face sometime. But with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much.